Okay, so I think we're going to get started. I know some people might have to run out in a few minutes, but thanks so much for being here. I'm Melanie Bhatti. I work in ETS and EdTech Services in LITS, and I coordinate the Tech Talk series, and this is the first one of the semester. We're really excited that you're here for it. I just wanted to make you aware that we have a poster and little small versions of the poster for the whole semester's worth of Tech Talk. So if you think you might want to come to another Tech Talk, please feel free to take a flyer for yourself. If you have like a bulletin board or an office or somewhere where people might look at posters, please feel free to take one and hang it up or hand them to people or whatever. The next one might be of interest to people who are interested in this topic. It's going to be about using Google Earth as a research tool, ways that you can use Google Earth to access spatial information even if you can't be physically present. So people who are interested in 3D imaging modeling applications might also be interested in that one. And that will be February 20th, which is a Tuesday, 4 to 5 p.m., same place. So I hope we'll see some of you there as well. Please sign in if you haven't already, even if it's on your way out, and I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks very much for that introduction and the announcements. And thank you all for being here. I know that even though it's early in the semester, it's a busy week for many people, and I appreciate you all coming, even if you can't stay for the whole lecture. So I'm Alex Brey. I'm a graduate student in the Department of History of Art here. And I'm going to be talking about 3D modeling and augmented reality for cultural heritage today. This is a subject that I've been thinking about on and off since about 2008, my senior year of undergraduate. I took a seminar on Chartres Cathedral with a student of Stephen Murray's, who is a professor at Columbia, and he's been doing this Mapping Gothic France project where they're going around with laser scanners and scanning all of the Gothic monuments in France. And during that seminar, I got really interested in virtual representations of cultural heritage. I wrote my final paper about an early implementation of structure from motion modeling, which I'll talk a little bit about today. So that's just a little bit of context for how I got interested in this topic and why I've been sort of actively following developments in the field and experimenting with it on my own. As far as the structure of the talk that I have planned today, I was going to introduce a couple of the key 3D modeling technologies that people are using at the moment, basically like the most popular ones. Looking at traditional 3D modeling, structure for motion modeling, which I just mentioned, next generation laser scanners, which might be new or unfamiliar to people here, and the developments in simultaneous locating and mapping, or what's known as SLAM. Then I want to move on to discuss augmented reality as such, looking at how it's been used for site-specific presentation and curation, and how it's also starting to be used for research and pedagogy, although this is like the wild frontier of augmented reality. And then at the end of the talk, we have 2 iPads here, and we wanted to give people the chance to play around with Sketchfab's default sort of augmented reality mode, so we can see some of the ways that this is already super user-friendly, even if it's not totally perfect. So traditional 3D modeling requires a 3D modeling program. Some of the more popular ones right now are SketchUp or Maya or 3ds Max. Depending on what you're using it for or what field you're coming from, different people have different preferences for 3D modeling programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own projects using these. In addition to a modeling program as such, if you want to make your models look pretty, you have to use a rendering program, which simulates the properties of light bouncing off of surfaces. And then you might further adjust the images or videos that you're producing through post-rendering editing. I've used Photoshop to do this, but other people might use like different video editing programs, for example. So for my dissertation, which is on early Islamic architectural decoration, I've been using SketchUp a lot, and it has a couple of advantages that make it appealing to people. How many people here have used SketchUp before? Okay, so like half of the people here. I think that's pretty representative of like how appealing it is to academics right now, because it has a free version. It has an excellent student discount for the full version. I think it's like $50 or something for the student full version of the program. And it comes with there are a couple of different options for rendering with SketchUp, more and less affordable ones. There's a couple of free plugins that you can use to render your models. But also occasionally really expensive rendering programs like V-Ray will have a beta program where when they're developing the next version of the software, they'll release a version of it for free to everyone for people to try out. And that was how I did all of like my rendering. I squeezed it all into like the 2 months that the V-Ray beta was out. So what we're looking at here, actually this was one of my really early experiments with rendering using Podium, which is a less expensive rendering program that is built to work specifically with SketchUp. And so like this is just to like contrast, this is a model as it's seen in SketchUp, which has its own sort of simplified rendering abilities. And then this is a version of it seen in Podium, where you actually have like different kinds of occlusion where objects are blocking light bounced off of other objects, that kind of thing. This is a different part of the same site that I was experimenting with. One of the things that I came to learn during this project is reconstructing monuments is easy when you have lots of other similar monuments to base your reconstruction on, and it's really hard when you don't have any. This monument is located in a suburb of Tehran. There are like basically no surviving parallels for it. So it's a terrible example of like what kind of monument you would want to pick to do a reconstruction from scratch on. It's a nightmare because you're just like, we don't really know what kind of roof this building would have had, for example. So like that whole dome is just a guess basically. And I didn't actually pursue this any further than this kind of like half-finished render that you see here, because I realized that like this wasn't a good candidate for the kind of reconstruction that I was hoping originally to do. Some of the other buildings that I've been working on for my dissertation are much better candidates for this. So, for example, there are these bathhouses in rural Jordan. 2 of them have survived almost completely intact, and one of them was basically like demolished to the floor level. But the one that was demolished to the floor level has these 2 spectacular mosaics, and I was really interested in presenting these mosaics in what would have been their sort of original architectural context. So I was able, based on the other surviving monuments, to do like really plausible 3D reconstructions of how these would have fit into the bathhouse, for example. This image is produced using SketchUp's default rendering options, and then like post-editing in Photoshop to make it look like a watercolor. I was going through did any of you read like The Way Things Work when you were little? I was going through like a way things work kind of phase. And then this is a render of another site that I'm working on in Central Asia. My dissertation is case studies, so basically these are the 3 case studies at the core of my dissertation. And this is a domestic space in a city in Central Asia in what's now Tajikistan that's been excavated and reconstructed. So this rendering I did using V-Ray, which is like an $800 rendering program, but again, I did it using the beta version when it was free. And just another example of the kinds of things that V-Ray can do. This is another building that I was modeling for my dissertation. all of these are kind of about putting architectural decoration, which is what I'm studying, back into their original architectural context. This is sort of like a recurring theme in how people are using 3D modeling and augmented reality more generally to approach cultural heritage. It's sort of like filling in the missing parts of monuments or objects. I'm going to skip over these because I don't know. I mean, if people are really interested in my dissertation project, I can talk about them, but basically it's like more of the same sort of modeling things in 3D software from scratch. One other slightly strange experience I had recently with 3D modeling from scratch was in a summer program I did last summer in Malaga, Spain, as part of the digital art history summer school. We took a painting by Vermeer that's been analyzed. The perspective has been sort of reconstructed, or deconstructed rather, by a scholar in a book called Vermeer's Camera, and we took all of his like measurements based on the perspective of the painting, which was probably produced using a camera obscura, a measuring device that artists use to create perspectively accurate images. And we basically modeled every part of this room that was in the Vermeer painting. This at first sounded like a totally useless exercise to me. I was like, oh man, why are we doing this? But it was a really interesting experience in terms of thinking about like the material culture of like 17th century Dutch elites, for example, you know, like what kind of viol de gamba do they have lying on the floor, or like why is the harpsichord decorated this way, that kind of thing. But it was also interesting for thinking about like the lighting of the image, because SketchUp comes with some, as a default, it comes with some pretty easy like lighting tools that let you adjust the angle of the sun that cast shadows across the room. So you can play around with like adjusting the lighting of spaces. It can do this fairly accurately, historically speaking, but it's not like you're going to be able to reconstruct how the rising sun hit an ancient monument 3,000 years ago or something. If you're really interested in like solar alignment, for example, it's probably not the program that you want to be using for that. So those are sort of like a general overview of like how I've been using 3D modeling from scratch in my work. I've also played around with structure from motion modeling, and there are probably people here who know more about this than I do at this point. Marianne in Special Collections organized a visit from the people who pioneered this technology. I think it was last summer. And I know there are graduate students in archaeology who are using it for their work. But basically, this technology consists of taking a bunch of photos of an object or a site from different angles, and then uploading them into a program that automatically reconstructs the 3D geometry of the object or monument. So this is great for objects that have really complicated surfaces that would be impossible to model by hand, or very, very difficult to model by hand in a program like SketchUp or Maya or something like that. I tried using this to map one of the archaeological sites that I'm looking at in Central Asia. I took like 300 photos of this the ruins of a palace in Uzbekistan, and this is what the program was able to produce as far as like a perspectival view and like a top-down plan of the site. I would say these are useful for me for thinking about like the spatial relationships between parts of the site, but they're not something that I'm going to put into an illustration in my dissertation or an article. Like they're not sort of like consumer-ready images, right? They're more like memory aids for me, basically. I've also used this technology on a stucco plaques from the very first site that I showed you that I was modeling. The site in Iran was decorated with these elaborate molded stucco panels, and the best examples of them are all located in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where they're in storage. And they're not even in like the easy to access storage. They're in like the long-term offsite storage where you have to make like a special appointment months in advance to get there. So I took a bunch of different photos of these from different angles and reconstructed them. And I'm using those as like I'm actually using those as illustrations in my dissertation because photographing them was also hard. You can get a photo of like the entire object because of the other objects in storage around it. So this was much more useful for me. And if you're able to stick around until the end, we can pull one of these models up on an iPad, and you can actually like play around with it as an augmented reality object, basically. So in addition to traditional 3D modeling and structure from motion modeling, there's what's called structured light modeling. These are like laser scanners are a good example of this. And laser scanners are super expensive. They're like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So getting your hands on one of those, you have to get like a huge National Science Foundation grant or something like that. But there are now what are called next generation laser scanners, which are much smaller and much more portable and much less expensive, although they're still very expensive. Like they're like $15,000 to $20,000. So we're still talking about like a big grant that you have to get to buy one of them. But they're more like, I don't know, they're a little bit more within reach. You could like run one for a project or something like that. Did any of you see the movie Prometheus? It's like a sort of sci-fi horror movie set on an alien planet, and they have these cool like little mappy gadgets that are like little balls that fly around with lasers and scan the interior of this ancient monument and produce this like point cloud representation of the interior of the structure. And that's basically like a literal translation of this next generation laser scanning technology into like a cinematic form. What the laser scanner looks like is this funny bobby thing that he's holding in his hand, and you have to hold a battery that it plugs into, but basically like you can walk around with it. And what it produces is a 3D point cloud similar to what you would get from structure for motion modeling like photogrammetry. That's super useful for modeling complex geometric spaces that would be either difficult to model by hand, or if you're really interested in doing documentation of cultural heritage, getting all of the weird wonky angles that are actually built into a structure, this is an ideal tool for that. And in Malaga, again, last summer at this digital art history summer school, I had the chance to play around with one of these in the Malaga Cathedral. We mapped the interior of the building. This is an example of the model they were able to produce of the Leaning Tower of Pisa's stairway, which has never been fully documented before. So that was an innovative thing when that happened. And then finally, to sort of like make the leap from 3D modeling into augmented reality, you need to be able to like dynamically locate the viewer that you're using in space. So the technology for this is like pretty recent. In the last 3 years or so, people have been able to do 3D modeling using what's called simultaneous location and mapping, or SLAM. So then like the next generation laser scanners use a version of this technology where as you move through space, it maps the area around you, and it also figures out where you are as you move through that space. So doing all those things at once is pretty complicated, and it's exciting that like we've gotten to the point where computers can do that. Computer scientists put in a lot of hard work, and engineers also put in a lot of hard work to make this happen. In the last couple of years, this has also reached the point where it's something you can do with a consumer-grade cell phone. there are cell phone cameras that come with infrared depth sensors, which you can use to simultaneously locate and map the space that you're in. So this is an example of someone using it to map their office, like a computer science graduate student or something. And you can see in the corner here the model that he's producing as he moves through his space using like an iPad with a infrared camera attached to it, basically. So all of these technologies that I've been talking about up to this point are ways of creating 3D information. And what I think is really exciting is that we're starting to see people using these 3D models that they've created in augmented reality technologies, taking them to like the next level, basically. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of how I've seen this be used in museums and other cultural heritage sites. There are many more uses for this technology, like life-saving ones in surgery, that kind of thing, but this is the area that I'm specializing in, so these are the uses for this technology that I've been following. One of the earliest examples that I've seen was in the monastery of Cluny in France, where they developed augmented reality flat panel TVs that were sort of stuck into the site and that show what 12th century visitors to the church would have seen when they were standing in that position. The first really like mobile version of this that I came across was an archaeological park in Germany called Carnuntum, where there was a school for gladiators, and they use the GPS in a phone to figure out where visitors are on the site, and then their cell phone app automatically opens up a 3D view of that space based on reconstructions. So as they turn through what's basically like an open field today, they have this like little window into the past in front of them. And this was like the moment for me when I saw this video where all of a sudden like the whole way that I thought about 3D modeling and augmented reality changed. I was like, this is the coolest thing. And like today it's like, yeah, everybody can do that. But it like literally I can do that basically. But like when this first came out, it was groundbreaking. One of the more elegant uses of it that I've seen has been to put architectural fragments in from the monastery of Moissac back into their architectural context. This and a number of the other examples that I'm going to show you were created using Google's augmented reality technology called Google Tango, which they just shut down recently. They folded it into their new Google AR core. And also using the Lenovo Fab 2 Pro cell phones, which have like a infrared camera on the back of the camera, so they get really accurate spatial data from that. And there's a little slider here where they can adjust the opacity of the reconstruction, and as like visitors move through the museum, they're able to actually see like what the cathedral would have looked like behind this portal, for example. It's basically the same technology as the Carnuntum project, but it's like, I don't know, seeing this one, I was like, whoa, this is so much cooler than the Carnuntum one. I don't know why. Because like consumer cell phones are able to do this kind of thing now, we see this happening like all over the world. Engineering students in Jordan, where I do research, have started using it so that visitors at museums can reconstruct missing parts of mosaics, for example. They made a cool little animation where the missing fragments of the mosaics sort of float back up into their original position. And again, this was built using Google Tango. And then I think this is an example from Beirut. Ignore this label information is wrong. I apologize for that. Yeah, this is from the American University in Beirut, where they took a amphora that was broken, 3D scanned it, reconstructed the missing part, and created an app where visitors to the museum can like move around the object and see the part that's missing from the object today. So there's this like recurring sort of theme and how people are using this for cultural heritage of like restoring lost elements of objects or putting objects back into their original context. At the Parthenon Museum in Greece, they have an app where you can see the Peplos Cora with her original painting. I have to say, I was there a couple of years ago, and I was like, why is everyone standing in front of that sculpture holding iPads? Like, are they taking photos of it? I don't understand. So I missed out on the opportunity to try that one in person. But when I saw this video, I was like, that must be what they were doing. And this is another example of sort of the same principle from the Yuanming Yuan Garden in China. This is one of the most celebrated historic gardens in China that was destroyed. And they've created a sort of like one of those tourist viewfinder binocular cameras, but instead of showing you the actual monument, it shows you like a 3D reconstruction of what it would have looked like. Those are sort of just to give you a sense of like the global adoption of these technologies and some of the trends and how people have been using them for cultural heritage. And then in this next section, I just wanted to briefly talk about a sort of suite of tools that the Detroit Institute of Arts has created using augmented reality that I think are kind of at like the cutting edge of what museums are doing with this material. They were using Google Tango and those cameras with the Lenovo cameras with the infrared depth sensors, and they created a set of tools that show how artifacts functioned, let you sort of see through objects, help you navigate through the museum, and illustrate how objects would have been produced. So this is an example of how they are using it to show how a cylinder seal, which is kind of a small stone basically, would have been used to create a seal impression. I think this is really useful for visitors to museums who don't have any idea of how these objects would have been originally used. When you look at it, it's just like a teeny little cylinder, and it doesn't make a lot of sense why it would be on display in a museum, for example. But I think this does a great job of illustrating the original function of these objects. They also had a CAT scan done of one of their mummies and created a tool that lets visitors see into the mummy, basically. They created a program that helps visitors find their way from point A to point B. You can basically say, I'm right here, I would like to get to this object. And it overlays a guide on the floor of the museum for you to follow between the two objects that you've selected. I think this is really cool, but I think I can also see curators being like, oh no, people are going to walk into sculptures because they're looking at the dots on the ground. I'm sure they had a lot of discussions about that as they were developing this. And then this final example shows the creative process for a sculpture sculpture from Africa. This sort of subtraction of pieces of a wooden column. I think these examples are all interesting because they seem to be doing something more than just sort of like restoring lost parts of objects or putting objects back into their original context. They're trying to illustrate other aspects of objects or create new ways of finding relationships between objects, for example. The most recent example that I've come across of people using augmented reality for cultural heritage stuff was the result of a study of the Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, where physicists from Japan used particle sensors, muon particle sensors, to photograph like the interior of the building, basically, and they detected a void in the structure, which they are illustrating here using augmented reality. I think they're using the HoloLens, but I'm not positive. And because I'm an art historian, I couldn't resist like juxtaposing these two images because it's like the same, like the future is now, or sort of. I haven't seen many cases where this technology is being used actively for research tools or for pedagogy. I'm sure it's out there, but it's not something that I've come across as frequently. I have seen one really spectacular example of how it's being used for archaeological research. An archaeologist in the UK created a reference library of 3D models of bones so that he can compare faunal remains he finds at the archaeological site to these 3D reference models that he's created. A lot of archaeologists have a collection of like physical faunal remains that they use as a reference, but this is like the first time I've seen somebody using augmented reality to create a research tool based on a digital collection of reference items. I think we're going to see more and more of this sort of thing. Like botanists for classifying leaves or that kind of thing. There are a bunch of other cool aspects to that app that he created. His website is called Dead Men's Eyes, and I would recommend checking it out if you're interested. He also lets you see like a map of the geographic distribution of the faunal remains. So if you're excavating in southern France, you can see like what is the territory where these similar faunal remains have been discovered, that kind of thing. Like all sorts of cool tools that he's built into this that I don't have time to like show all of them today. But as I was going through making this presentation, the question that kept occurring to me is how does taking museum objects out of their context or putting them back into their original context change the way that we see them? And partly I think we have to figure out how wedded we are to the idea of original context, because it seems pretty important to most of the people who are using this so far. There's this desire people have to like put the facade back into its original context, whereas I don't know. I guess the thing that I'm really excited about with this technology, though, is that objects that we see in these carefully controlled and staged spaces like museums, we have the chance to set them free. Like with the Sketchfab app that we're going to play around with, you can place objects that museums have 3D modeled anywhere you want. You can put them on the floor in here, you can put them on your desk in your bedroom, or I don't know, there's just this sort of ability to take objects out of their cloistered museum sort of contexts and sort of like set them free into the world. So I'm curious to see how, as this takes off, how people might start to think about cultural heritage differently when it's something that you can just sort of like pull up wherever you are and like actually like physically engage with. So thanks very much for coming. We have these two iPads up here with Sketchfab on them, so maybe you guys can come up and we can play around with them.
Do you want to take, are there any questions before we
Yeah.
move on to playing?
Yeah.
I know one of my professors from a few years ago, Thomas Warren, was very interested in digital recreation of historical
Roman cities and stuff, yeah.
What do you think? Well, I guess my question is: do you think that archaeologists should put the majority of their focus on recreating digital models in different media, or continue to put a lot of their effort in actually preserving the physical site?
I think it can be both, right? I mean, if you have to choose between the two, I would definitely pick preserving the site. But, I mean, sometimes logistically it's not possible to work on preserving the site. For example, like for my case study in Iran, like I'm really interested in the current state of that archaeological site, but I can't go to Iran. And even if I could, there was no way that I could be involved in finding ways to present that to the public there.
Right. I guess the thing that interests me is it seems like nowadays file types and different digital media changes extremely
super
fast.
rapidly.
So
Yeah.
It's almost like you have to how do you preserve digital
Yes.
representations now?
That's a great question. I think part of it, what our expectations for what these things do is going to shift. We're not going to expect these 3D models to be around forever. We're going to recognize that they're rhetorical objects that we're creating for a specific time and place. And they may get preserved for other reasons than the ones we create them for, or they may not. So yeah, that's a great point, definitely. Any other questions? Are people in the Praxis course thinking about doing something cultural heritage related at all in their projects? Are you all going to do one project, or are you going to do individual projects? Or
I think we do a small group project, so we'll have a couple different projects.
okay, cool. I hope you guys are going to do some sort of presentation of what you create at the end.
This semester we will.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys do. I wish I could participate, but my schedule is a mess this semester because I'm finishing my dissertation. So, but I really look forward to seeing what you guys all produce. I'm sure it's going to be awesome.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have two iPads here if anyone wants to go look at things in Sketchfab. It's pretty cool.